Compañeros, welcome to the SQL Data Partners podcast, the podcast dedicated to SQL Server-related topics, which is designed to help you become familiar with what's out there, how you might use those features, or ideas on how you might apply them in your environments. I am Carlos L. Chacon.
And I am Steve Stedman. We are two data professionals trying to help others get a better handle on their database environments, either through this podcast, our training, or our consulting practice. Thanks for joining us on the SQL Trail. Welcome to the show.
SQL Data Partners.
Compañeros, welcome aboard the SQL Trail. This is episode 119.
Yes, 119, and today's topic is getting started.
Right, so
Quite a few things lined up to cover here today.
that's right. And so obviously GitHub being a source control product, and there's lots of flavors here. And when you think about GitHub, you could probably put yourself in one of a couple of buckets here, right? So one, you've never heard of GitHub.
Right.
Don't know what it is.
And at this point, you're wondering what the heck we're talking about.
So we hope to provide a little bit of information there again, and maybe some at the end of the program. If you haven't gotten started, now you'll have at least some direction to go further. Maybe the other bucket is you've heard about GitHub and you're scared.
Maybe scared is not the right word, but you might not know where to go.
Sure, and I intimidated was intimidated is a word I would have used in describing myself, and I still kind of feel that way to a certain extent. So let's say you've used other source control, but you don't know Git per se.
Yep.
And then those folks, this last group, folks, those of you who should be doing this episode with us.
Right. The real pros who want to share the information.
Yeah, exactly. Who are using it. I'm not sure how valuable this episode will be. I mean, obviously, we're going to share some opinions or thoughts on some things, but we're not going to be uncovering, particularly in an audio format, anything, deep, dark Git secret or, GitHub secret. So
Sure.
There is that. And then this last group is, so those who have drunk the Kool-Aid, the GitHub Kool-Aid, and basically it's GitHub or bust.
Right.
Yeah.
And those are the ones who, if you're using anything else, you're unworthy, basically.
Yes. So our conversation is is with an emphasis on GitHub, but we admittedly are going to break away a little bit from that. We'll be referencing things like TFS as well. Going to break away a little bit from that. We'll be referencing things like TFS as well. And so, yeah, if GitHub is your thing and you hearing other repositories is going to make your ears bleed, then this episode's not for you either.
Right. But before we really get into the details there, do we have any Compañero shout-outs this week?
We do have a shout-out. We want to give a shout-out to Nikki V from the Netherlands. Nikki V left a comment on the website talking about episode 115. He mentioned, "I loved your fun and honest review of the SQL Trail." And so we appreciate that and hope to see you, Nikki, on the SQL Trail someday.
Nice. And then we had another one from Andy Levy.
Yeah.
He liked episode 117, which was our wrap-up of Summit.
That's right. And enjoyed kind of hearing some of the comments there. And we enjoyed meeting him at Summit, obviously.
Yep.
Another Steve, but Justin, I believe is in Alabama now. He shared, we were talking and he mentioned a script that he had to help find potential foreign keys.
Oh.
And he shared that with me. And so I haven't been able to go through it just yet, but I'm grateful to him for sharing it with me. And it may actually come in handy on a project that we're working on. So,
yep.
Kind of an interesting idea. Yeah. So we mentioned it last week. We'll mention it again. So now through the end of the year, we want to start collecting your tips and tricks. We're going to start adding in a tips and tricks section, very similar to SQL Server in the news. However, we want this section to come predominantly from you, the listener.
Right. And that could be really in two flavors. Help with those too.
Yeah, there you go. Any of those combinations, you can go to sqldatapartners.com/podcast. On that page, you can either leave the comment, missions of ideas, or tips and tricks, or you can use the online recording and record a segment of what you'd like to, what your tip and trick is.
Then, coming up on December 14th, we have a special event planned.
That's right. And I should say probably a reoccurring event. Something else we're adding into the mix here.
Yep. And this is the Database Health Monitor webcast. And when we say it's recurring, probably do it every month or maybe every couple months, but it's not going to be the same every time. We'll cover different topics or different parts of the program.
That's right. So we've tested out our video equipment and it hasn't broken just yet. And so we were thinking we'd add a little video to the mix here. So they're going to be short, probably 30-minute segments, very similar to the podcast, but it's going to be focused on Database Health Monitor and kind of monitoring and those interactions with your and we're going to do those interactions with your system.
Yep. And with that, it'll be a live broadcast, right?
That's right. Yeah. So we'll record it and then make it available, through YouTube and whatnot afterwards.
Right. But people can attend live through the GoToMeeting connection, correct?
Correct.
Yep. So
at SQLDataPartners.com/webcast, you can go there and sign up for the next episode. And we're going to do those the second Thursday of every month is the plan.
So then if somebody has questions, we'll do our part of it. And then at the end, we'll open it up to Q&A.
That's right. That's right. So we're hoping everyone finds that valuable and just another way to connect with you all, do something in a live setting. And again, not hours and hours, but, very similar. You've seen other folks, out there in the community doing something similar. And we're looking to put our spin on it. And with that, restricting it. So this, and it's in this segment only because one, we were just talking about it with a client. And then I happened to be looking at the Microsoft blog. And there was actually an article about this last month. And so I said, oh, well, if they're talking about it, we should be talking about it. And ultimately, it's this idea of securing your Azure VMs or Azure SQL database and restricting it by IP address. And so you and I were talking, and ultimately what we had was a scenario where a client wanted to give us access to their VMs.
Right.
And we got a username and a password, and I'm like, well, I haven't given you my IP address. How am I going to connect to this thing? And I'm like, well, let me just try really quick. And I could connect. And I was like, yeesh. And so we talked a little bit about this, and I think connect. And I was like, yeesh. And so we talked a little bit about this, and I think, I'm not sure. I guess I was thinking maybe it was Azure SQL Database, but it sounds like they even changed that. And maybe I don't know if it's just my process now, right, where I'm locking that down automatically, so that it's just something that I do. I'm adding those IP addresses, but basically the idea is that everyone or you can, by default, those are exposed on the internet. So if you know the IP address, you can basically start trying to get in there. And right. Not a good idea, right?
Yep. But I think part of what they do is they have to do it that way so that you can get connected there to begin with before you've actually done anything to lock it down. So I think that just a lot of the time people overlook that. And I think that's both with Azure databases and with Azure VMs.
Right. Well, I guess I feel like I can do that in the dashboard. Those firewall rules, enabled. So I guess that's part of the puzzling thing.
But I would bet that if they made it so that you had to set that up before you could actually connect to limit where you can connect from, that a lot of people would not get past that because it's not entirely intuitive how to do it.
No, I agree. And then there are a million ways to go ahead and do that, right? So like if you have a point-to-point VPN, right, then that's different than me being from my home and I just want to give my IP address because I'm the only one that's going to be connecting to it.
Exactly.
Right.
Yep.
And so there are some complexities there, and I kind of see that. But I think again, if that's something that you're working with, you're doing something in Azure, that's a conversation you want to start having, right? Don't start spinning up those databases and just leave them there, right? You need to make sure that you're talking to your network folks and making sure that they get locked down.
Yep, absolutely. All right.
So our show notes for today's episode is going to be at /GitHub
or at SQLDataPartners.com/119 for our episode number.
That's right. And so as we were putting this together, and obviously we were recording just before Thanksgiving, and so happy Thanksgiving. Hopefully everyone had a happy Thanksgiving, because this will come out after Thanksgiving. And we were thinking about, well, what do we want to be talking about? And so this idea of GitHub, at least in my mind, you think about the changing nature of the DBA position, and I feel like I'm hearing just a lot more about GitHub.
Yep.
And so I thought we'd talk a little bit about maybe why that is, and then kind of get into it. There.
What's interesting here, Carlos, is when you first brought up the topic of GitHub, I kind of thought to myself, well, we're doing the SQL podcast. Why are we talking about GitHub?
Right.
After looking at it a little bit and thinking about it a bit more, I realized how much we actually use it as DBAs.
Right.
And although it's not directly a SQL Server thing, one of those corollary things that's really important to be able to understand what it is and how it works.
No, that's right. And I'm reminded, so I'm not sure if the quote is attributed to him, but I heard it first from Andy Leonard, right? And this quote that he had, he's like, there are really two types of, and I can't remember if he said DBAs or IT professionals, right? But there are those who are using source control, and then there are those who will be using source control after some disaster.
Right.
Yeah. And so, and again, ultimately, that's what we're talking about is a source control technology, but it almost seems like, in a sense, that is like almost a de facto way that people are starting to push. And when I say people, particularly Microsoft, right? So their documentation is now on GitHub, or you can see it on the website. But as far as being able to interact with it, having people contribute to it, like that's now an option, right? That's how the people who are pushing, to this GitHub repository.
Right. And I think that's an interesting way to use GitHub, because you're almost just using it as a distribution mechanism.
Right.
In some extent, with the ability to get feedback. And I guess if you're accepting code changes from the community, then that's different, because you're actually taking changes in.
Right. Yeah. And I think we can get into that, maybe pros and cons, or, good and bad of what that means. But yeah, I think, you're right. They're kind of using it as a way just to distribute that information. I think about, it seems like any more of the code samples, if you want a code sample, so they have come up with, so there was worldwide, and I'm probably butchering that name, right? I just imagine somebody correcting me. I want to say worldwide importers,
right,
or wide world importers, or whatever it was, right? It was made available kind of the next version of AdventureWorks, or was made available kind of the next version of AdventureWorks, or another sample database. But then they've actually come out with another one since that, and basically they're like, oh, go get it on GitHub. I haven't seen links for it, like, hey, download it here. It's like, go to GitHub. There are all the samples. People are changing it. They're kind of, massaging it there. I think about like Cosmos DB samples and things like that, for example.
Yep.
Right. It's all there. And you're like, oh gosh, I now have to interact with that. Right.
Yeah. And what's interesting is it might be maybe a little bit more trusted there, because you can go and see the history and go and get more information on it. And it's not just, of course, coming from Microsoft is different, but if it's coming from,
sure,
I don't know, some third-party tool vendor out there that you may have never heard of, do you trust what's on GitHub more than what's on their website? I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? And I think, again, that so kind of the influence of the open source community, and that, we should have visibility into how the soup is being made, if you will. Yeah, I think definitely contributes to that. So that is interesting, right?
Yep.
So a couple of other reasons quickly. So if you've been using Codeplex, for example, I know Codeplex is, you could put together a tool, throw it up there, kind of share it with the community. As of December 1, that's going to be read only. So if you want to be doing things, I know, like, so for example, the PAL tool is one of the tools that I have used in the past. The creators or the maintainers of those applications won't be able to use Codeplex anymore, and they're moving everything to GitHub.
Interesting.
And then the last one is, you see a lot of employers starting to ask for that in the interview process, right?
Yeah, this is one I saw a couple years ago where they actually said, we don't care about your resume, just give us your GitHub username and we can look at what you've done. Which, yeah, I thought maybe that was a little bit, you miss a lot of,
I think
didn't necessarily happen on GitHub. publicly.
Yeah, exactly, right. That's probably an emphasis of maybe focusing too much, almost like on a particular technology stack potentially, right? Is that a lot of people would go to the wayside, but I think it is. I mean, I think you'd have to agree that it's probably the most popular repository now, right? I mean,
Oh yeah, yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
and so because of that, right? It's just one of those. It's almost like, and if you're not on Facebook, right? It's like, come on, like everybody's there. Even if you're not posting there all the time, just that ability to log in and then kind of connect with the other world, the rest of the world, right? I kind of feel like that's kind of what GitHub has become.
Yep.
In a sense.
Yep.
So,
and I think that, there's a lot of different uses there for what you can do with GitHub. One is something big like Microsoft distributing sample databases. Ozar does with his SP Blitz and other scripts that he does, where he distributes those, but he also gets a lot of feedback and changes from people.
Yep.
And I think that that's a great way to use it, to be able to take those changes back and be able to integrate them into your base code there.
Yeah, DBA tools is another example of that, right?
Yep.
Yep.
But then there's, like, let's say you're a company and you've got your private intellectual property that you want to keep private for whatever reason. You're making a product.
Right.
There's GitHub options that you can pay for that will give you private repos and even private on-site repos with GitHub. That's very different than sort of the free open source collaboration method there too.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I guess that's an interesting question. Let's go ahead and dive into that for a bit, because ultimately with GitHub, you can have a repository, right? That's kind of like your folder, your project. That's kind of where all the files are gonna go for that, for that project, right? And you can have public versus private. Now, I think it makes a lot of sense. I'm a private company. I'm selling, whatever. I'm selling a piece of software. I want to keep that private. It's IP that I have.
Right.
Now, the question is, the way we've kind of framed it or talked about it is that it's the open source. You want people to see what you've done. Even if maybe you're not having people, collaborate with you, it's, that book of work may still be important to you. Why would you then, does everything have to be public, or do you still have things that are private versus public? Admittedly, everything that I have out there is public.
Right.
And which is not very much. Let's just say I have 2 repositories, right? So it's not, so please don't think that I, slaying all this code, or anything. So please don't think that I, slaying all this code, or anything. I put out we put out the 2 repositories are for the Zero to SQL book. I put out the scripts to create that database and made it from a distribution perspective, very similar to what we talked about. And then the other one was our database setup.
Right.
And we were hoping that people would contribute to that and maybe, get that started.
Yep. But there's other uses too for private repos. And I have quite a few more than you do there. But some of the examples of what I do is I have one that's called presentations. It's private, but it has every presentation that I've done at a conference, a SQL Saturday, past summit, whatever, for the last 7 or 8 years, I've got in there. So if I remember that, that was in a presentation I did 5 years ago, I want to go find that. It's all there in a private repo. Some people might argue that it'd be better to put that out in a public repo. There's a lot of stuff I'm working on there for public consumption yet.
Right. And that's kind of another interesting, idea and almost like the policy of your repository and the purpose, because I think you almost have like little islands, right? Or little reasons, different reasons why people are putting out those repositories, and they're not all the same. Like you mentioned, everything might not be ready for prime time.
Yep.
And so, yeah, that is an interesting take. And so how you decide to set that up, I think you need to be clear about that. If you're going to make a public repository, you need to be clear, like, hey, this is just for me, this is part of my body of work, or, however you want to say that, maybe a bit more eloquently, but make that known up front. And another vein could be even as simple as like, hey, here's how we do certain, or here's our policy on like case or,
right.
Formatting, things like that,
standards.
right?
Yep.
Coding standards. There you go.
But I think for community contribution, and that that you're hoping that people will fork it and then use it on, and then contribute and push it back into what you've done. And I think that that's kind of the assumption, but that's not always the case there with public repos.
Sure. And so I guess, maybe that's a philosophical, question at this point, but, why would you put out a public repo if you didn't want anybody to contribute to it?
That's a great question. I mean,
but we do know that there are people that are doing that.
Right. So,
and
would you, if you had a public repo and you didn't want anyone to contribute or add to it in any way, would you be bothered if they did? Or would you, like if somebody came along and came up with some super cool enhancement for whatever it was you had there, and they did a pull request so that you could review it and maybe integrate it back into your code base, so that you could review it and maybe integrate it back into your code base.
Right.
I mean, there's some out there I've seen where they're just going to say, no, I don't want it. I don't want anything anybody contributes because it's not mine. That's not my mentality, but there's some of that out there.
Well, in their defense, we've talked about this, on other episodes. Even go back to like the community contributions episode that we did with, we interviewed Brent and Chrissy.
Yep.
It takes a lot of time. I mean, it's one thing to write the code, right? And so anybody who knows who's tried, done that branching and, merging all that stuff back in and then testing, right? You're now taking responsibility for all of that as the owner of that repository.
Certainly.
And so so there are pluses and minuses there as well too, right?
And some of that may depend on how complex it is. I mean, there's a lot of code out there in that DBA tools project.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
It's many orders of magnitude different from our setup script that we put in our public repo.
Okay, so I guess
our setup script that we put in our public repo. I mean, one's like a single page, and the other is gigantic.
right. Lots and lots of functions in some of those.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess so. Ultimately, I think dealing with that. If you do go private, so you have that ability to say yes, I want to share it with the world, or no, I don't. I think like we've talked about, most people are thinking, or the expectation is you go public because you want to share it, you want people to contribute to it. But then there are potentially some consequences with that.
Yep.
Although, having said that, I guess I would say, particularly if you're new, and I still consider myself to be new to that, to that community. We've put those things up there. We have like a couple of watchers, but we haven't actually had anybody contribute. And so I don't think you should be so afraid. A lot of time and branding and all of those things until it gets on, noticed or picked up, right? Almost like your blog in that sense.
Right. But the other thing to be aware of too, if you're looking at someone's repo there, public repo on GitHub, look at like how often it's been maintained or when it's been updated. When was it last changed? And I know, for instance, I had some project I did 5 or 6 years ago that was like a weekend thing that I thought, oh, this is going to be cool. I'm going to make it available for everybody. And I threw it up on GitHub and I haven't touched it since. And I hope if people are looking at that, they're not judging me on what I know based off of what I did on that project, because that was just sort of like a weekend thing I threw together and never quite finished it,
Right.
And I probably should have gone back and deleted it, but I never did.
Yeah, that's right. So there are all kinds of projects out there, right? Now another thought or question I had was around licenses, right? So at least in GitHub, when you go up, you create that there. Around licenses, right? So at least in GitHub, when you go up, you create that repository, it's going to ask you about some licenses. So, which admittedly, I don't know very much. I usually just take the default and put it up there. Should we be, if you're kind of just getting started, you wanted to start, put something up there. Should we be concerned about the kind of license we choose?
Well, I think only if you care about any kind of liability around your code, or where it can go, or who it can be used by, or whether people can make money off of your work. I mean, if any of those things matter to you, then yes, you should be concerned about the licensing.
Gotcha.
There are some that use this in whatever way you want, but not for commercial. Just you can't make money off of it. And then there's others that say use it in whatever way you want, but you can't modify it. Or, I mean, there's appropriate licenses for almost every scenario you can imagine out there.
Right. But again, I guess I wouldn't get too bogged down.
New licensing, there's some of the MIT licensing, there's a handful of other licensing options in there. I don't remember them off the top of my head either, but just make sure you know. I mean, you take a look at it at least to see what it is, but don't let that stop you. I mean, and it might be that you create a repo and you realize, whoops, that was the wrong licensing. Maybe I have to go back and change that later.
Yeah, there you go. And asking around never hurts, particularly if you know somebody else is in the community or, your developer friend. They'll be able to help you with that, some of that stuff. The other thing that I think, I don't know if it's specific to GitHub per se. I'm trying to think about it. I'm not sure that there's an equivalent in TFS, but one of the things it's going to want you to do, or that it can do for you when you create that repository, just a little box, is to create the README file.
Oh, yeah. And that's super helpful.
Right. But I think that README ultimately is, again, because it's thinking under the premise of it being a public project, is here are the rules, right?
Right. But even more than that, that README is really the main visual representation of all info around your project when somebody first visits your project page.
Sure.
Because that's
and kind of the why.
See. Yeah. And that might link off to many other pages, but it's sort of like, what is your project? Why are you doing it? And like, what are the rules around it,
Right. Exactly. And so, putting some time and thought into that, again, it doesn't have to be super fancy, but at least letting people know, like, hey, the only reason this is here is because I want to add this to my body of work, or, hey, this is what I'm looking to build. I'd love you to join me, that kind of thing.
Yep. Definitely worth looking at for any GitHub project that you take that someone else created that you're viewing.
Right.
That someone else created that you're viewing.
Right. Yeah, and that would probably be another great way just to get some ideas there. Just peek around at some of the other ones, like we mentioned. So Brent stuff is up there. The DBA tools stuff is up there. I know that there are some others, like all the CodePlex stuff that's moving over. If you can find your project now in GitHub, you can take a peek there because they're all going to have READMEs.
Yep.
Now, once we've kind of put all this together, obviously, so at least my first interaction with GitHub, and I would say 90% of my interaction with GitHub has been through the browser. But there are plenty of tools that are available that you can then, use, to download, and so you don't have to interact with the browser.
Right.
I think probably I don't know if it's the most popular, the most common. I don't know. This is according to Carlos. I don't have any numbers to back that statement up, but the GitHub desktop app.
Sure.
And modify your files.
Yep.
Interact with your repository.
Yep. Other things that are available there too are the Git Bash shell, which is what I personally use. And it's basically a bash type command shell, if you're familiar with Unix or Linux bash. And it has all the GitHub commands in there, and you can do everything kind of like a DOS prompt, but in a shell window. Lets you not have to use your mouse and click through the GUI. And I think it comes down to what do you like more yourself? I mean, are you more of a mouse type person, or are you more of a keyboard person? And for me, the bash shell is great because I like the keyboard more than the mouse.
There you go. And I think once you get the commands down, right, then it becomes a little easier. Now, that is the one knock against the desktop app, is that you'll use it and you'll never learn those commands. Right. So there is kind of a jump that you may have to take. But a lot of the tutorials like on YouTube and whatnot can go over the common ones. Right. So bringing the repository down locally so you can work on it. Of course, you're saving the file and then getting it back up there. Like that's half the battle right there. Right.
And then sort of halfway in between those is Visual Studio. If you're working in Visual Studio, you have an integrated Git project there. You can do a lot of the Git commands through just the normal Visual Studio code check-in section.
Right. From the Microsoft perspective, if you're looking to get started and you have those tools, is that I think the barrier to entry is a little bit easier because it's going to be in an environment that you're more familiar with.
Yep.
I'm curious. Now, you came from a developer background, so did you even mess around with the desktop, or did you go straight into the bash?
I didn't even try the desktop. I just went straight to bash. I mean, I've been using source that I grew up with, using source control for 27, 28 years now.
Right.
And I mean, most of it's been command line. So that's kind of
Gotcha.
what I learned on as a kid and grew up with.
Right. Okay. A slightly different perspective. I did not grow up writing Bash. If you're familiar, like with even the Redgate stuff, that's their source code tool.
It's
So
the SQL source control.
yeah, SQL source control. There you go. That's the name of it.
Yep.
So that might be your first step. It's a very SSMS driven interface, right? That allows you to easily, get those objects and kind of put them up. Then you kind of get into and that integrates well with TFS if you're using that, and then kind of going into the Visual Studio stuff. I think more and more people are going to start going that route if you haven't already, just because your teams are kind of expecting that. That's their interface for a lot of people. Way around it, but it was difficult for us working with developers that were also writing the scripts, putting in the Redgate tool. They wanted to use a single tool. And at least at the time, now this is a couple of years ago, at the time, Visual Studio and Redgate weren't quite compatible. And so we ended up just having to use Visual Studio. And I think that's probably going to be common for a lot of people.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, because I know I've used the Redgate SQL source control project in a software development environment where developers were making code changes and checking it all in through Management Studio using Redgate's product. And
yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. But then their code on the front end side, they've got to check in through Visual Studio, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And some of that it was done through other tools besides Visual Studio. So it was just a straight check in. But that's sort of the beauty of it is that when you use like Redgate's product, it's just part of a source control. Redgate's product, it's just part of a source control project. It doesn't have to be that way for everything. You can use Visual Studio, you can use other stuff. Git is very open to lots of different tools like that.
Okay. Yeah. There you go. I think more where I was going is that they wanted, for whatever reason, again, because we may be late to the party, the developers didn't want to have two tools to be able to check in code.
Oh, I see.
And so, they wanted to just do everything through a single, a single repository.
Gotcha. So, yeah. So that makes sense.
Yeah. So I guess we kind of talked about this, but I'll bring it back. So so if you haven't gotten into that, and again, so I only have two repositories, so it's not like I'm a GitHub pro or anything, but I feel like get out there, at least create an account. Now this brings up the question: maybe you're not quite ready. Maybe you have some things that you're working on. You have some scripts, right? So again, I'm kind of coming at right. So again, I'm kind of coming at this from a body of evidence perspective. I want my future employer to know who I am and be able to share some of the things that I've done, right? However, I am happy to share, but I'm not interested in really the contributions perspective.
Right.
Should we still encourage people to use GitHub if they're the only ones working on the project?
Well, I guess let me back up a little bit on a couple of terminology things before we answer that one. So,
okay, here we go.
Okay, so we've got Git, and Git is basically a source control product. And then we have GitHub, who happens to be a hosting vendor that has free repos or paid repos or private ones. There's also other vendors out there, like Atlassian has Bitbucket, which is also they're a Git-hosted cloud-based solution. Different gotcha. UI tools when you're working through the browser. Still command line, it's exactly the same thing or whether you're working from the GitHub desktop or Git desktop.
Okay.
So when we say if you're working on a project on your own and you don't really want contribution on it, I would recommend, yes, you should be in source control. Does it have to be public on GitHub? No. Will it help you next time you're at a job interview and someone wants to look at code examples you've worked on? Yeah, perhaps it will. But is there intellectual property that you've created in that source control that you don't want to give away to the world?
Mm-hmm.
Then yes, you should have it in source control, but it probably shouldn't be public in that case.
Yeah.
Does that answer what you're getting at there?
Yeah, I think so, right? So I think, that question would be particularly if there's just scripts that you've written, and I think we mentioned even Justin's script that he gave to me. I'm not sure that he's ready to share that with the world just yet. Those things that you could put out there, he's not didn't put that together with the intention of making money on it. And so if you have those types of things that you could put out there, I think it makes a lot of sense to try it out, be involved in the community and just kind of, help get your name out there.
Yeah. I can think of one that at Past Summit, I presented, one of my presentations was on backup and recovery, and I shared with people a script that would allow you to build your backup script through your log chain.
Ah, there you go.
That was one that I have it in source control in my private repo, and then occasionally I just put it in a zip file and put it out on my website. Mm-hmm. However, thinking through that, that's the wrong way to do that. I should just take that and put that one in a public repo, because all the source code is available to anyone who wants to use it just by downloading the script today. And it would be a lot easier to maintain and if somebody has feedback or they want to suggest a change, that one would be much easier to have in a public repo.
Right. And so that's interesting. So we kind of talked about this, actually before we started recording, you mentioned, we talked about this idea of, in certain cases, I wouldn't want to go to GitHub. I just download it from the person's website. I think some of that was maybe pre-GitHub or pre-open source control, if that's the right terminology, because that was the only way to distribute some of that stuff. Now we kind of have this de facto way of like, instead of me having to then take the code, put it all together, compile it if that's a step that I have to take, and then zip it up and put it up on my website. Once I've uploaded it, done. Right? Now everybody else can just kind of take it from there. So you do save yourself a little bit of hassle there.
Yep. And I think the difference there is like that restore script I was talking about for my demo. I mean, that's a single file. If somebody wants to go is one link to download it on GitHub or click one link to download it on my website. Either way, you're just getting a single file. But if it's something much more complex, like take Brent's Blitz scripts, where he's got quite a few of them that do different things, it might be easier to just grab it off of a website, zipped up.
Sure.
Versus grabbing a handful of different files to download. I don't know, maybe, and I haven't really looked at his stuff there too much, but maybe he's got a bundle or an install package now.
Right. Well, I think even in that, so in that case, right, they're probably different scripts, and are you going to use all of them, right? So it's almost like I only care about this specific code for right now. Instead of downloading 4 files, I'm only going to use one of them.
Yep.
I don't know.
And I guess I probably should have gone and looked at Brent's GitHub setup before we talked about it. I would have been much more informed on that one. But I know I looked at it when he put it out there several months ago. I just haven't really been back since then.
Try to go
at it when he put it out there several months ago. I just haven't really been back since then.
Sure. Okay. So again, ultimately, I thought kind of interesting conversation around, how we can start interacting better with GitHub. Again, I have an account. It's not like I have a tons of repositories out there, but I feel like I'm connected. I feel like I have at least tried to go through the motions there. Because I think more and more it's going to become, I won't say required. It won't be required, but I think we'll see it. We'll just continue to see it more and more.
Yep.
But however, they're not the only game in town, right? There's lots of different, we talked about a couple, and I think, ultimately our message is, yes, use source control and do what makes most sense for you.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that, as long as you're using source control to keep track of what you're doing and you've got the appropriate ways to distribute it, GitHub's great for that, but
I'd love for you to lots of them. Okay, well, I think that's going to do it for today's episode. Our music for SQL Server in the News is by Mansardian using our Creative Commons. As always, you can connect with us on social media. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback. You can leave comments on our website. And we do still allow reviews on iTunes. For those of you iTunes users, we'd love for you to leave a comment there. Connect with us on LinkedIn. I'm at Carlos L. Chacon.
And you can get me on LinkedIn at Steve Stedman. And we'll see you on the SQL Trail.
SQL Day.